Everybody, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And I'm Justin Crisp.
So we get together once a week to talk about the gospel for the upcoming Sunday. And I must say today, I am over-revved on this gospel. Today's gospel is the Transfiguration. It is the last Sunday of Epiphany. And I'm so fired up. You know, if C.S. Lewis said that the greatest event in the history of humanity was the incarnation, I would say what we have today is the greatest religious experience in the New Testament outside of the resurrection appearances. And if the Christmas Epiphany cycle would have it that we go with God became man, and now today at the end of the cycle we see that man is God. I mean, this is everything. Let's go to the text. Matthew 17, 1-9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead."
Wow, well, you set the bar really high.
I did set the bar high.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
the greatest spiritual experience.
Outside of the resurrection appearances.
Yeah, wow. You took me to a new place because I never read that story in this way. I feel like it's a story that is still a head scratcher to this day. And it was, I don't know if it's intended for Peter and James and John, or if it's for Jesus, or, if it's for the Matthean community that follows. I don't know, I have a couple of thoughts. I think that it could be that given that Matthew is the sort of new Torah interpretation, this could be the new great commandment, that God is saying, "This is my son, listen to him." And, it's sort of the commandment that we miss, it's that still small voice. Here's Jesus next to Elijah, and, God is saying this out loud to them, and it's still so hard for us to listen to Jesus. I think it's really hard to listen for the voice, and we get very caught up in all these other smaller commandments. But I've never experienced it myself. I'm excited to hear what you have to say to take me there, because it's, to me, a story that's so outside of ordinary possibility or experience that anybody I know has had. And I'm not saying people don't have these kinds of experiences, but it might have been this one-off for these disciples at that time. Whereas the resurrection or something like that, we can really move in and experience that. And that's the hope, is we all experience that through our lives. And Transfiguration for me feels like a very gratuitous gift to Peter, James, and John, who have just, Peter's just declared that he believes Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus proceeds to say, "But I'm not that kind of a Messiah." And maybe they're like, "Oh no, this is not what we thought." And they need some kind of like bolstering reassurance that they have the right guy. So I sort of go at it that way, that it's a gift we get to hear about and not necessarily move into in the same way.
That's interesting. I think it's interesting partly because I think that I acknowledge the fireworks here. I do think that the Transfiguration, the event of the Transfiguration, is in some ways singular and unique. But I think that transfiguration as such is something which actually happens all of the time. And that what we have here is a variation on the theme of the perception of the beautiful in and through material anything. So if you think about the experience of being enraptured by a piece of music, right? You have the material, the actual material of the thing, or like the sound waves, right? But when you're perceiving a symphony as beautiful, it's because you're having an experience not of the sound waves, but of the music. And there is something about the process of sound waves becoming music that is a transfiguration. You're beholding the beautiful in and through this material something, or if you think about it, the more obvious example is probably a painting, right? So you have the actual brush strokes and the actual physical artifact, but then you see the it's as though the painting reaches out to you. It's like the painting gives itself to you. You perceive splendor or beauty in and through the brush strokes, so that there is something about the perception of the beautiful through a material thing which is greater than the sum of the parts of the material thing. And that's what it's been a little while since I mentioned my favorite theologian. I was going through a Karl Barth phase in the fall, and so I got to come back to Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Amen,
here.
brother.
I'm waiting for the René Girard interpretation of the Transfiguration from Elizabeth later. So von Balthasar is going to come shrieking, descending from the ceiling here. But Balthasar calls this sum is greater than the partsness of the perception of beauty, form. And so we see form in all of this material stuff. And I think that what we see here is the disciples see the form of God in Jesus. Jesus is the form of God, and a form for Balthasar is different than a sign or a symbol. So a sign or a symbol points to something. The form, though, is the manifestation of the thing. It somehow is the presence of the thing in and through this material something or other. It's not that the painting points to beauty, it's that the painting is a manifestation of beauty. And in the same way, Jesus is not a symbol of God. Jesus is the form of God. This is not a sign, it's a theophany. And it's a theophany that harkens back to the theophanies of Exodus chapter 13 and Exodus chapter 24, where there's a cloud on top of a mountain, on top of Mount Sinai and so on, and God is said to be within the cloud. You also have references here, I think, to in the references to Moses and Elijah, you've got the pointing to the law and the prophets. So there is a lot going on there. I think that the narrative here is trying to depict the glory of God coming through Jesus. And even though that is singular, mind-boggling, mind-blowing, I actually still think it's a variation on a theme. It's a variation on an experience we actually have quite commonly. Perhaps not with these fireworks, but I think it happens to many of us all of the time, actually.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. So it's interesting kind of three takes here to start. For me, I can move into this piece so much as I can't move out of it.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so I'm Peter in complete form. Okay.
You built the booth.
I built the booth. and
Which we don't have.
I'm Peter in complete form. This, for me, is more real than Jesus sometimes walking along the ground along the river. Yeah. I would say, secondly, if you want to talk about art, this, for me, is the Hallelujah Chorus. And so the Hallelujah Chorus in the oratorio isn't at the end. It's sort of,
it is,
it's 2/3 of the way through. And this in Matthew is 2/3 of the way through. And we have the Hallelujah Chorus. And that everything in this is explosive in its glory and in its evocativeness. You can't understand the story unless you understand what each piece of this means with reference to the Hebrew Scriptures. We're talking about Jesus as the fulfillment of the Scriptures. And so if you don't mind my just picking at a few things. One is who's it for? Peter, James, and John. A question. So we know that in the New Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that for things to be affirmed as real, there needs to be 2 or 3 witnesses. And so here Jesus takes with him 2 or 3 witnesses to affirm the reality of this. And that this is not, and that in all religious experience, we might say for our religious experience that we receive, if it's profound enough, it's not just for us, it's to be shared. And here we have religious experience that is to be shared, and through the witness shared, generationally, obviously generationally. And so they're, of course, you've noted that they're up on the mountain. And in the Hebrew Scriptures, if you're going to have a profound religious experience of God, you're up on a mountain. That's just the way it is. I mean, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, same thing. Mount Moriah, and I mean, there's about 6 mounts in the Hebrew Scriptures, and so it doesn't matter which mountain he's on. I mean, there's a disagreement in the Scripture. I mean, by the scholars, whether or not it's Mount Hermon. Hermon, as it's called, which is up in the Golan Heights, is enormous, 11,000 feet up in the air, or whether or not it's Mount Tabor, which is down in the Jezreel Valley, which is 1,900 feet up in the air. But it's on a mountain, and that's what matters, because this is the place of all of these theophanies, and that Jesus is transfigured. And so here we get, this is where we get metamorphosis from. So, and this is the God became man and man became God. So now we see Jesus's identity. Hey, Jesus ain't nothing if he doesn't have this identity. Right? This thing is so important that to miss this is to miss Jesus, is just to have Jesus as a wisdom teacher only. I mean, this is the Son of Godness, not just the Son of Manness, which I get so fired up by it. And that his face shining. Well, you know that. I mean, Moses goes up on the mountain and his face shines. So here we have the new Moses. But the Mongo difference is Jesus' face shines from the inside out. And Moses' face shone because he was exposed to God. But here the exposure of God is from the inside out. And all the other references to faces shining. I mean, the Scriptures are full of divine face shining. And the clothing is dazzling. I mean, my gosh, this is the angel, this is the angelic, this is the heavenly clothing. He's got heavenly clothing on. We see that in the book of Revelation when the armies are wearing white linen and they got white horses. And we see this at the man next to the tomb. We see this at the ascension with the 2 guys sitting. I love the 2 guys sitting next to Jesus at the ascension, and then they say, "What are you looking at?" or something. It's like, what are you kidding? And why are you looking up in the sky? But anyway, we get all of that. And then, Moses and Elijah, so we get the Scriptures there, the fulfillment of that. Each of these guys also had religious experience on mountaintops, and each of these guys had weird ends of their lives. I mean, I don't think, what's weirder, the swing low, sweet chariot for Elijah, or that God buries Moses somewhere that nobody knows?
Oh, my gosh.
I mean, I think that's as odd. When I was over there, and they're like, well, we think Moses is buried over here. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is when I was over in Jordan.
That's exactly right.
Well,
how do you
somewhere in Jordan, people were saying that we think Moses is over here, and that the. Sorry, I know I'm taking up too much airtime, but
really
you're revved
I
up.
am. I'm over revved for this,
We're with you.
And but we don't get, this version of it is not, excuse me, Matthew. This is not the best version of this. Luke's got a better version because Luke tells you, what are they talking about, right? Here we get nothing about what they're talking about. And he says in Luke, we're talking about their departure, which is really the word Exodus, and Jesus is Exodus. And so we have the whole Mosaic Exodus event. But the Exodus isn't just for the Israelites. The Exodus is for the whole of humanity. And Jesus' death is his exile. So we miss that here. So we don't get what they're talking about, which I'm sorry about. We also don't get the religious experience of Peter and James and John, who, remember, they were falling asleep, and in contemplative theology, that was considered a sort of form of deep prayer. We don't get that these guys are sleeping. Maybe it's nighttime. And then we get, we get the voice here, right? And, what are we going to do with this voice? Oh, well, let me just say the funny part where Peter's response, we need to build these tents kind of thing. And then in Luke, he says he didn't know what he was talking about, which I always think is funny. I think Luke was a really nice guy. I do. I think Luke was a really nice guy. He's putting in excuses for this. But here, these tents, these are the tabernacles. This was where the covenant was in the tent of meeting, and the booths. The first time I was in Brooklyn and I saw all the booths, all these things on people's porches, celebrating the 40 years in the wilderness, and then the clouds descending. I mean, the cloud is the theophany of God. I mean, it's God's clothing. We're led by a pillar of cloud by day, all the cloud stuff. And the new tabernacle is Jesus. So Peter's absolutely right. He got the tabernacle thing about halfway true. But the tabernacle walked down the mountain with him. It didn't stay on the top. That's what's going on here. So we have this thing, and then we get "This is my beloved son," right? Yeah. And that's a bunch of pieces of scripture. That's the Psalm. This is my son. This is my beloved one. That's Isaiah. The Messiah in Isaiah, and listen to him. And this is my Chad Bird guy said it was to him listen, because the emphasis is on to him, and all this, and so. And the disciples fall to their faces. It's exactly where they belong, on your face. I got to be quiet. Rob just told me I'd talk for 15 minutes straight. I'm going to back up here.
No.
I'm going to let this go. But there's
I think he said, and I loved every minute.
I got more to say, so I'm just going to stop because it'll ruin the conversation here. Now, I think this is the mountaintop experience that the church, the followers of Jesus, have been living off since the Transfiguration. Without this, we are impoverished. Now, I know this is only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's not in John. But in John, everything is kind of transfigured. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus is that dude walking on the ground, crunch, crunch, crunch. You can hear his feet half the time, as you always point out. And Luke, he's walking on the road. Without this mountaintop experience, we don't know the fullness of Jesus. We need this. We need this.
Yeah. Well, as much as in Luke they're on a road, and in Matthew they're on mountains. You already said that. I mean, I think that's exactly what's going on. And apparently, or possibly, this gospel was written in Sinai, and they're all looking for a new way to conceive of a temple. So, this structure is really important. So I'm just going to nibble around the edges, because that's, how can I, I would never, I think that's incredible how you've unfolded that for me, because I really have struggled to find a really central place for this story. And I do think it's powerful, don't get me wrong, but I feel like, I really appreciate your take on it, Justin. It's a manifestation of the thing all the signs are pointing to, and we do need that. Like, we need these glimpses, to pull back the curtain. And I heard one preacher talk about this story as the way we read a novel that's getting so dark and grim, you're not sure you want to finish it, and you're like, this story is not going to end well. And so you look at the back. You cheat and read the end, and you discover, all the characters make it, and it ends happy, and so it's almost like the disciples get this, and Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone how it ends, until after I've been raised from the dead." And I don't know what he means by that, but it's interesting, that statement and that instruction not to talk about it. And however could you contain such a vision? At least they had each other to talk about it with, right? But anyway, I liked that analogy, that it was such a confidence builder and such a reassurance that in the middle of the journey, they could, rest assured this would end well. And, and in terms, as far as Moses and Elijah, I think for Matthew, these are the archetypes of the law and the prophets. And, it's the Hall of Fame of the Bible. So Jesus is there with his fellow Hells of Famers, and he's more so. And if, as you said, the 2 or 3 witnesses, maybe they're there to witness to Jesus also. That and then they vanish, and Jesus is left there alone by himself. In terms of you asked for the Girardian take. Well, I wasn't going to do it, but I
go for it.
How do you know everything? How do you know when his takes on everything? You do. You seem to know everything.
No, there are certain phrases like "Son of Man." I think that René Girard himself takes a lot from that phrase from Daniel. Daniel 7. I saw one like a human being coming in the clouds, and when Paul's writing his letters, he talks about the new Adam. So for Girard, he throughout his takes on this, and people who follow the Girardian sort of line, Jesus is the new human, or the new generation of human, and comes to usher in the new humanity. And, to be when the Son of Man has been raised from the dead, we're all being raised from the dead. We're born anew. We're like, there's a whole new way of being human. And that's the transformative, transfigured state for Peter, James, and John and all of us, is to witness this new human making us into new humans and new ways of being human. So I'm sure it's more complex than that in the Girardian school, but that's my sort of like broad brushstroke on what that perspective would bring.
No, that's really, really good. Elizabeth, I'm taken with a couple of things that you say, particularly, I just have to say, I took my my Day Pitney, pen
I have
here.
One of those.
Oh my gosh!
I think we all have one. Shout out to our senior warden, the world's best senior warden, Stan Torty, for these Day Pitney pens here. In any case, that was, I feel like there needs to be some kind of legal disclaimer, but Day Pitney could probably help us with what that legal disclaimer needs to be, right? There's nothing has been exchanged.
As long as they tithe the proceeds that they get from this
yeah, the firm's going to really blow up now that they've gotten a spot on Rev'd Up for Sunday. Anyway,
game changer.
I actually, while you were writing, Elizabeth, I drew a heart on it was unconscious.
Aww.
I drew a heart on my paper when you were saying the end of the novel.
Nice.
And I wrote, the heart is beside the end of the novel. It is exactly like that. It's like skipping to the end. And I was, so the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, Ramsey wrote a book on the Transfiguration and the concept of the glory of God in the Scriptures. Ramsey was an incredible theologian, influenced by Karl Barth, most well known only to people who are interested in English theology, which are like Episcopalians and Anglicans, and that's basically it. But I think he's way underrated, underrated. His training was primarily not in theology, but in biblical studies. And so he does a word study of glory in the Hebrew and in the Greek, and that's how he builds his theology on top of that. It's really, really interesting. He notes a couple of things that both of you have noted. The first is that there's no transfiguration scene in John, and he thinks that's because the entire Gospel of John is designed to mediate exactly the kind of experience which the disciples are having here on the mountaintop. That in the reading of the Gospel of John, the glory of God is supposed to shine through Jesus, and you're supposed to be able to perceive that just as the disciples perceived it here on the mountaintop in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The second thing he notes is that it's there is a kind of deferral of Jesus's glory in Matthew, Mark, and Luke and the synoptics until after his death and resurrection. And so the transfiguration is like a down payment on that explosion of the revelation of God's glory in the face of Jesus. And so what you get here is like skipping to the end of the novel. I had written down on my paper, also with my Day Pitney pen, a little earlier, that this tell no one about the vision. I'm like, that's a Markan leftover. Matthew has got to be borrowing that from Mark. And I have some ideas about what Mark is up to when Mark says things like that. Like, don't tell anybody about this, et cetera.
They're in mortal danger in that gospel. The readers, right?
Exactly, right? So that makes a kind of sense to me. I have no idea what Matthew is doing with it. I really don't know what Matthew is doing with it. I'll say to some of what you were sharing, Peter, that I also love this story. For me, this is the vocabulary of my relationship with God, because I've interpreted it as being about the experience of beauty. And the reason why I believe in God is because I have been overwhelmed with the beauty of God at various moments in my life. And the reason why I'm a Christian is because I have been overwhelmed by the beauty of God in this person, Jesus, in the reading of stories about him, in prayer and so on. I'm a Christian because I think it is beautiful, and I believe in God because I have experienced the beauty of God. These experiences have sometimes had fireworks a little bit like this. I remember my grandfather, who was a Southern Baptist pastor who I've spoken about on the podcast before. My grandfather, he was an incredible man. Towards the end of his life, he got very, very gentle. I mean, he was a formidable man. I don't think that man was ever afraid a day in his life. At least he never let us know he was afraid a day in his life. This guy, anyway, a lot to say about my grandfather. At one point, he got himself deputized so he could go arrest somebody who had committed a crime.
We should have a whole podcast on your grandfather, clearly.
Oh, my
revelation of your grandpop.
Oh, man, Bethel Crisp, the Reverend Bethel Crisp. Anyway, but
even his name is worthy of
You're totally right. Yeah. But he's Southern Gothic, totally. But he got very, very, very gentle towards the end of his life, and he looked at me one day. He cried a lot at the end of his life, and he looked at me. He had tears streaming down his face, and he said, "Justin, has the glory of God ever just overwhelmed you so much that you just had to pull your car over to the side of the road, get out, get on your knees?" And I'm like,
holy cow.
Well,
I take my glasses off.
I know. I'm like, well, not yet, Paul. So
good answer.
I cannot say that has happened to me, although that happened to him. That I can't say that has happened to me, but what has happened to me is listening to the end of Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra.
Oh, I love that.
Oh my gosh, I do too. Where the end is variations on a theme of this tune by Henry Purcell, and when the tune comes back out of the spiraling chaos of this fugue that he's written in the last variation is just magnificent. I mean, just thinking about it makes me want to cry. Peter, your sister Ellen, hi to Ellen, who I know listens to Rev'd Up for Sunday. Your sister Ellen gave me a set of these books on the history of opera, that belonged to your mother. And a couple of weeks ago, some stuff, chaotic stuff, was happening in Jules and my life, and Jewel went to bed, and I did what I do, which is sit downstairs and listen to music. And I listened to the end of Valkyrie, the opera by Richard Wagner, where Wotan's saying goodbye to Brunhilde, and I was crying, and I was just clutching the book because it was just so beautiful. And that's how I think what's happening to me in moments like that is I am perceiving the beauty of God through the beauty of God's creation. I'm perceiving the beauty of God through a creature, and that is something like, it's not identical to, but it is something like what's happening here in the Transfiguration, that this material stuff is being transfigured in such a way that it produces awe in me, and it produces consolation, it produces love. And Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, said that a mostly reliable sign of authentic religious experience is whether it produces tears or not. Mm-hmm. And that's why, when my grandfather said that story about having to pull over to the side of the road and he was crying when he was telling me, I was like, oh, wow, well, not yet, Paul, but I believe you. Mm-hmm. Beauty does make me cry. And so I wonder what is the tear-jerking things that make God real for us. Mm-hmm. And that is, I think, that for me is what I read in this story. That's the vocabulary this story gives me to talk about God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an incredible, that whole thing that unfolded is incredible, including your grandpa. And you're clutching my mother's opera books that were in the basement of our house for years when I was growing up.
You didn't clutch them?
They were actually in the attic near my baseball cards. But anyway, the question of religious experience, which is what you're describing here, and some of what we can begin to unfold is what's happening to Peter, James, and John. And this, again, also isn't in Luke, and I know I just named Luke as the best version, but it says when the disciples heard this, so now they're hearing the voice of God. They fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. I always think that we always struggle with that word fear in our language, by our ears, how we think of fear. I think sometimes the translation there might become they were overcome by an awe-inspiring experience that silenced them and made them feel very small.
Yes.
And so they got very low to the ground, I think is another way to perhaps translate that. And, we talk about the living Christ, so we talk about Trinitarian experiences of the divine, we talk about touches. I think one of the most touching, this is not in Luke, one of the most touching parts of this, it says, but Jesus came and touched them. Mm-hmm. We actually have very few stories of Jesus touching people outside of healing them.
That's interesting.
in the Gospels. I mean, Jesus does all sorts of things. I love it when Jesus spits in his hand and mixes with mud and rubs it on your eyes. Every time Jesus spits, I'm down with the Gospel because I'm like, I get that. I really understand this guy. But anyway, and so the laying on of hands, which is a part of our tradition in a big way. I mean, just take a look at the Acts of the Apostles and how that grows out through the healing movements of our time today. But Jesus touched them, came and touched them. I mean, you can almost feel the gentleness of Jesus's hand on their backs as he's, kind of like, it's okay. We're okay here. We're okay here. As he reaches out and touches them. And, and he says, get up. I don't believe this get up is like, get up. Like, like trying to get your adolescent son out of bed in the morning when he's going to be late for school. That's not what this is. This is it's okay to get up and don't be afraid that they have witnessed the holy and they don't have an emotional category to put it because they've not had these experiences before. And so they get low, they get down, and whatever happened, they feel about the size of a thimble. And Jesus seeks, and says, kind of it's okay. And then when it says, and they looked up, so now you can almost see them peeling their eyes off the face downness of the ground and seeing that they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. And that's how this thing is supposed to end, because I think you call them fireworks, the Moses and the Elijah thing that you refer to, that is all to say it's about Jesus. Okay, this is the curtain moment where all this stuff happens, and when the curtain sort of, the stage clears and the light is singularly on Jesus, that's what's happening here. It's not like, where did those other guys go? Right, those other guys already fulfilled their role. And interestingly, back to my man Chad Bird, who was quoting Saint Ephrem of Syria, who said, for the heavenly beings of Moses and Elijah in the Epiphany, they were able to see the humanity of Jesus. But for Peter, James, and John, they were able to see the divinity of Jesus. This is why this thing is so good. This is so good. And I think the reason we need this is because we believe in Jesus as the way and the truth and the life. If we're going to say that, that has to get us to the divine, right? And if the divine is something, it ain't us. Right, it's not, and it is the land of light and love, all in large letters. And so now we get a taste of the life to come in the life of Jesus as he was, hidden in his humanity, which is how we get most of it. And yet Jesus's touch is so, I swear it's as gentle as two fingers barely touching. It's as nuanced and gentle. That's, I think, is what's happening. Is he is caring for these guys. He is loving them. And then on the way down, he says, "Don't tell anybody." I'm with you. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm on it. I tell anybody. I would be like, right. Once I get over the silence here, man, you're not going to be able to show me. Particularly Peter, who clearly cannot be shut up.
Right. Well, this is amazing. I really appreciate, Justin, how you equate the experience of beauty with a glimpse of God and manifestation of God, because I too have had that experience. I mean, I don't often get brought to tears by beauty, but it's it hits me on a deep place where you can't really speak about it or articulate always. And Peter, I love that image of Jesus touching them. And I mean, I do think they probably were also pretty afraid. I mean, the way Jesus says, "Do not be afraid," he has to repeat that over and over throughout all his teachings. But I also love your nuance that it's more of the awe-struck silence. You cannot. There's no response except what just happened and that being low to the ground. But I think that he takes them back down the mountain, and he wants them to keep on going. And it makes me think of Martin Luther King's speech about I have seen the mountaintop. And how could that man have carried on? How could the movement have carried on had he not had a vision like this and known that there was a reality just on the other side?
Totally.
And not just in the future, but there for the taking. And in a way, it just, the people need to experience that vision too and move into it. So it's not just for the future, but Jesus said, he's get up, do not be afraid, and then took him down the mountain to go live in light of this vision and be transformed. And so I like it as not so much a eschatological glimpse as much as like a booster for the right now, the work ahead, and also the darkness that they were going to walk through with Jesus, and then come out on the other side. So maybe he says, I mean, some people say he told them not to tell anyone because they wouldn't have any idea what it meant until after that. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So maybe that's why they would sound nutty if he went to be crucified and they'd all said, oh, but he's, like Moses and Elijah. And, but it would only take a few days for them to be vindicated. Yeah. But still, it's just curious how even in Matthew's time, full 80 years later, whatever it is, 60, 70 years later, that he would write it this way.
Yeah. What you're saying, Elizabeth, it prompts me to say it is a crime that Christians are so often so cheerless. Yeah. And so, I mean, there are versions of Christianity which seem to suck all of the joy out of life. I know that we've talked about this in the last couple of podcasts during the season of Epiphany. I know that the last time we spoke about the Transfiguration, we entertained the idea, what would happen if we built Christianity around the changing of the water into wine, that sign in the Gospel of John, Jesus' first miracle, right? God, the party animal. How would it look different? What reminds me of that right now is this vision of both what is to come and what is, which permits people like Martin Luther King Jr. not to lose hope, to take heart, to continue to engage in struggles for justice, or in struggles to persevere through, suffering with a capital and a lowercase s, right? What is most public and most social, and what is most private and most individual and personal? What is it that permits people to persevere, to get by, and to go through life with a kind of joy, notwithstanding whatever happens to one, or Christianity doesn't remove the struggles, I think, but I think that the heart of the thing is joy, and that the joy that's being communicated to the disciples here in the get up, do not be afraid, everything that's summed up in Jesus' touch, the joy that's given to them because the curtain has been peeled back and they can see Jesus as he is, they can perceive his divinity. They've skipped to the end of the novel, they know how the story's going to end. This is all supposed to be true of us today. It can be true of us today. My favorite verse in all of Scripture is from the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have conquered the world." And the world doesn't look like Jesus has conquered it. I'll just say that. It doesn't, right? I feel like every single podcast there's some episode of things Justin would rather be than a Christian, whether it's an existentialist or an Aristotelian or whatever. That's not where I'm at, but I will say that, the reason why I struggle with that so much is because the world doesn't look like Jesus has conquered it. It doesn't. I mean, the world is a crazy, terrible place. And also, it's a world of incredible beauty. It's a genuine mixed bag. But the reason why I'm a Christian is because I've been so overwhelmed by the beauty of Jesus and so overwhelmed by the beauty of God in the ways I've described, that I have actually come to believe that Jesus has conquered the world, even when it doesn't look like it. That there is more to be done, that there is more to be done, but I have skipped to the end of the novel, and I know how it's going to end. And that, to me, to the extent that I've had experienced suffering with a capital or a lowercase s, that's why I've been able to keep my joy. And when I look at people who, and the reason why I've had that is partly because I've seen people who have experienced suffering with a capital and a lowercase s, and they keep their joy, and this is why. Martin Luther King Jr. being one, my grandparents, including my grandfather, being another. I think that I have caught that kind of, I've skipped to the end of the novelness of our faith from other people. And I'm catching a little bit of it from the two of you too, in your over-revness, Peter, and Elizabeth, in your in all that you said about the novel and about hope.
Geez, Justin, I thought you were going to say in her under-revness.
Under-revness.
Hey, take a subtle.
Yeah. I thought,
That wasn't subtle, boss.
yeah. Hey, there's nothing that delights me more than you and these conversations. And Rob, you too, in the back, who's trying to always get us to stop talking. I just have to say, learn and learn and learn as we dive into the Scriptures. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to invite all of you to learn and learn and learn and dive into the Scriptures more. Maranatha House Church is revved up for Lent. This coming Lent, we're in the last Sunday of Epiphany. Ash Wednesday is Wednesday, and we're going to begin what we call here Maranatha House Church's Maranatha, Aramaic for Come Lord Jesus, Come Lord, the last prayer in the New Testament, a prayer that we in our community gather around, and particularly in Lent as we gather around the Scriptures. We're coming down the mountain. And Lent, we're going to go down the mountain, and we invite you to gather with other members here at St. Mark's. You can gather in person, or you can gather on Zoom. You need to be in touch with us. We're going to be putting up on our website all of the times where these gatherings are going to happen. We will shorten our podcasts so that real human beings can listen to them. And we will try to shorten our podcasts.
We didn't talk about that beforehand.
No, I'm just dropping that on there. And so that the scripture of this Sunday and the reflections on our pod, and then the communal reflections in each of the house churches. So we invite you to launch into Jesus' life. That's what we're inviting you to do. We've seen the mountaintop. We're going down the mountain. And so come on along that journey in Lent with all of us, because we'd like to take it together as we walk in our Lord's footsteps. So peace be with you. Thanks for hanging in. God bless, and we'll see you again. Take care.